47 men in one night, lowered down a 400-foot cliff, one at a time, using nothing but a rope and his own 2 hands. Japanese soldiers were everywhere. Bullets were flying, and he went back, again and again and again, 47 times. His name was Desmond Doss. He was a private first class in the United States Army, a combat medic with the 77th Infantry Division, and he had never fired a weapon in his life. He refused to carry a gun. He refused to kill. He wouldn't even touch a rifle during training. The Army called him a conscientious objector. His fellow soldiers called him a coward. His commanding officers tried to have him discharged, court-martialed, declared mentally unfit for service. And then came Hacksaw Ridge, and the men who had mocked him, who had thrown boots at him in the barracks, who had promised to shoot him themselves if he ever made it to combat, watched in disbelief as Desmond Doss crawled through enemy fire to save their lives. This is the story of the soldier who wouldn't kill, but became the most decorated medic in American military history. The man of faith who walked into hell without a weapon and brought back the wounded. The hero who disappeared into obscurity and didn't want anyone to know his name. And it begins with a picture on a wall in Lynchburg, Virginia. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7th, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia. His family was poor. His father, William, was a carpenter who struggled to find work during the Depression. His mother, Bertha, took in laundry to help make ends meet. They lived in a small house in the Blue Ridge foothills, surrounded by the kind of poverty that grinds people down. But the Doss family had something that money couldn't buy. They had faith. Bertha Doss was a devout Seventh-day Adventist, and she raised her children in that tradition. They went to church on Saturday, the Sabbath. They didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't eat pork. They believed in the literal truth of the Bible. And on the wall of their home hung a framed poster. It showed the 10 Commandments, illustrated with pictures. Young Desmond was fascinated by one image in particular. It depicted Cain standing over the body of Abel, the first murder in human history. Underneath were the words, "Thou shalt not kill." Desmond stared at that picture for hours. He couldn't understand how one brother could kill another. He couldn't understand how anyone could take a human life. The commandment wasn't a suggestion, it was an absolute. Thou shalt not kill, period. He made a vow to himself. He would never take a life, no matter what. It was easy to keep that vow in the quiet hills of Virginia. It would be much harder on the battlefields of the Pacific. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941, Desmond Doss faced a dilemma. He was 22 years old, working at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia. The work was classified as essential to the war effort, which meant he could have avoided military service entirely. Many men in his position did exactly that. But Doss didn't want to avoid service. He believed in his country. He believed the war against fascism was just. He wanted to serve. He just didn't want to kill. In April 1942, he enlisted in the United States Army. He requested assignment to the Medical Corps, where he could serve as a medic, saving lives instead of taking them. The Army granted his request and classified him as a conscientious objector, though Doss himself preferred the term conscientious cooperator. He wasn't opposed to military service, he just wouldn't carry a weapon. Basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, was brutal. Not because of the physical demands, though those were hard enough. The brutality came from his fellow soldiers. They called him a coward, a religious nut, a liability who would get them all killed. They threw boots at him while he slept. They made his life miserable in 100 small ways. One soldier promised that when they got into combat, the first bullet would be for Doss, not for the enemy. His commanding officers were no better. They tried to have him transferred out of the unit. When that failed, they tried to have him court-martialed for refusing to carry a rifle. The case went all the way up the chain of command before it was determined that conscientious objectors had a legal right to serve without bearing arms. Doss stayed with his unit, the 77th Infantry Division, Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment. The men who hated him would soon depend on him for their lives. The 77th Infantry Division saw its first combat in the Pacific. Guam, late, hard fighting against entrenched Japanese defenders. Doss proved himself in both campaigns, treating wounded soldiers under fire, exposing himself to danger to reach men who needed help. The soldiers who had mocked him began to change their minds. This little guy from Virginia might not carry a gun, but he was no coward. Then came Okinawa, April 1945, the last major battle of the Pacific War, and the worst. Okinawa was defended by over 100,000 Japanese troops, dug into a network of caves, tunnels, and fortified positions. The terrain was brutal, steep ridges, narrow valleys, terrain that favored the defender at every turn. The Japanese strategy was simple: make the Americans pay for every inch of ground in blood, make the cost of invasion so high that they would negotiate for peace instead of continuing to Japan itself. The 77th Division was assigned to take a position called the Maeda Escarpment. The Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge. It was a 400-foot cliff face that rose straight up from the valley floor. At the top was a plateau, roughly 400 yards long and 100 yards wide. The Japanese had fortified every inch of it. Bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions, tunnels that connected everything underground. To take Hacksaw Ridge, the Americans would have to climb the cliff under fire, reach the top, and then fight their way across the plateau against an enemy who knew every rock and hole. It was a nightmare assignment. On April 29, 1945, the first assault began. Cargo nets were hung down the cliff face. Rope ladders were secured. The men of Company B began to climb. Doss climbed with them, his medical kit on his back, no weapon in his hands. They reached the top, and then hell opened up. Japanese machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Mortar rounds rained down. Men fell screaming, hit by bullets they never saw coming. The Americans tried to advance, but every move forward brought more casualties. Within hours, the attack had stalled. Bodies littered the plateau. Desmond Doss went to work. While bullets flew around him, he crawled to wounded men, bandaged their wounds, dragged them to cover. He worked without stopping, moving from casualty to casualty, ignoring the fire that seemed to come from every direction. Other medics were hit. Doss kept going. The assault was called off. The Americans retreated down the cliff, leaving their dead and many of their wounded on top of the ridge. It was a disaster. They would have to try again. The next assault came on May 5, 1945. This time, a full battalion pushed over the cliff edge. Over 150 men of Company B made it to the top. They advanced across the plateau, fighting bunker to bunker, losing men with every yard gained. And then the Japanese counterattacked. They poured out of their tunnels, hundreds of them, overwhelming the American positions. The battalion fell back, then it broke. Men ran for the cliff edge, desperate to escape the slaughter. Most of Company B made it back down, but dozens of wounded men were left on top of the ridge. Men who couldn't walk, men who couldn't crawl, men who were lying in shell holes and behind rocks, listening to the Japanese search parties moving through the darkness, bayoneting any American they found alive. Desmond Doss did not retreat. When the rest of the company fled down the cliff, he stayed on top, alone, unarmed, surrounded by Japanese soldiers, and he began to look for wounded men. What happened next defies explanation. It defies military logic. It defies everything we think we know about human limitations. Doss crawled through the darkness, finding wounded Americans one by one. He bandaged their wounds. He gave them morphine. Then he dragged them, one at a time, to the edge of the cliff. He had fashioned a rope into a makeshift harness, using a technique he remembered from working at a lumber yard. He wrapped the rope around a tree stump, lowered each man down the 400-foot cliff face, then went back for another. One man, then another, then another. All through the night, while Japanese patrols moved across the ridge, Doss kept working. He prayed with each trip, "Lord, please help me get one more, just one more." By dawn, he had rescued approximately 75 men, 75 wounded soldiers who would have died on that ridge, either from their wounds or at the hands of Japanese bayonets. 75 men who went home to their families because one medic refused to leave them behind. Doss himself estimated the number at around 50. The Army officially credited him with 75. The truth is probably somewhere in between. In the chaos of that night, no one was counting. They were too busy trying to survive. But even the conservative estimate is staggering. 47 men, in one night, lowered down a cliff, one at a time, while enemy soldiers hunted in the darkness. The fighting on Hacksaw Ridge continued for weeks. Doss stayed with his unit, treating wounded men, exposing himself to fire again and again. On May 21, during another assault, he was finally hit. A grenade exploded near him, sending shrapnel into his legs. While being carried to safety on a stretcher, he saw another wounded man nearby. Doss rolled off the stretcher and insisted the other man be evacuated first. While waiting for the stretcher bearers to return, he was hit again. A sniper's bullet shattered his arm. Doss fashioned a splint from a rifle stock, the only time he ever touched a weapon during the war, and crawled 300 yards to the aid station. His war was over, but his legend was just beginning. The men of Company B told their story. The medic who had stayed on the ridge, the conscientious objector who had saved dozens of lives, the man they had once called a coward who turned out to be the bravest among them. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was unanimous. On October 12, 1945, Desmond Doss stood in the White House Rose Garden. It was his 26th birthday. President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck, making him the first conscientious objector to receive the nation's highest military decoration. Truman shook his hand and said, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Doss was overwhelmed. He hadn't sought recognition. He hadn't wanted fame. He had simply done what his faith required him to do: save lives, help others, be willing to sacrifice himself for his fellow man. And then Desmond Doss disappeared. Not literally, of course. He went home to Virginia, married his sweetheart Dorothy, and tried to build a normal life. But the war had taken its toll: the grenade wounds, the shattered arm. He also contracted tuberculosis, probably from the conditions on Okinawa. He spent 5 years in and out of VA hospitals. Doctors removed one of his lungs and 5 ribs. He lost most of his hearing from an overdose of antibiotics. He received a full disability pension. He could have lived comfortably on that, a wounded hero resting on his laurels. Instead, he went to work. He raised cattle on a small farm in Georgia. He helped his neighbors. He went to church every Saturday. He lived quietly, humbly, exactly as he had before the war made him famous. He refused to capitalize on his fame. He turned down book deals. He declined speaking engagements. When people asked about Hacksaw Ridge, he gave them the short version and changed the subject. He didn't want to be a celebrity. He didn't want to be worshipped. He just wanted to live his faith, day by day, in the small ways that mattered. For decades, his story was largely forgotten. The Medal of Honor Society knew about him. Military historians studied his case, but the general public had moved on. World War II faded into history. The men who had been on Hacksaw Ridge grew old and passed away. Desmond Doss became a footnote, a curiosity, the answer to a trivia question about conscientious objectors. That's how he wanted it. He had never sought glory. He had sought only to serve, to save lives, to live according to his beliefs, no matter the cost. Dorothy Doss died in 1991 after 50 years of marriage. Desmond remarried in 1993 to a woman named Frances who had known him for years. They lived together on his small farm, 2 elderly people enjoying their final years in peace. In 2004, a documentary filmmaker named Terry Benedict tracked Doss down. He had heard the story of Hacksaw Ridge and couldn't believe it hadn't been told more widely. With Doss's reluctant permission, Benedict made a documentary called The Conscientious Objector. It aired on television and won several awards. Suddenly, people were talking about Desmond Doss again. Doss was embarrassed by the attention. He didn't think he had done anything special. He had just done his job. He had just lived his faith. The men he saved, they were the heroes. They had fought against terrible odds. He had just helped them survive. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. He was buried in the National Cemetery in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with full military honors. The man who wouldn't carry a gun was laid to rest among thousands of soldiers who had. 10 years later, in 2016, director Mel Gibson released Hacksaw Ridge, a major motion picture about Doss's life. Andrew Garfield played Doss and was nominated for an Academy Award. The film won 2 Oscars and grossed nearly $200 million worldwide. Suddenly, everyone knew the story of the medic who saved 47 men, or 75, or however many it really was. Doss never saw the film. He died a decade before it was made. But perhaps that's fitting. He never wanted the spotlight. He never wanted to be a hero in anyone's eyes but God's. There's a question that gets asked about Desmond Doss. How did he do it? How did one man, without a weapon, save so many lives in a single night? How did he survive when so many others died? Doss had a simple answer: faith. He believed that God was with him on that ridge. He believed that God guided him to each wounded man. He believed that God gave him the strength to lower them down that cliff, one at a time, through the longest night of his life. You don't have to share his faith to recognize what he accomplished. You don't have to believe in divine intervention to see the courage it took. What Doss did on Hacksaw Ridge was extraordinary by any measure. Religious or secular, believer or skeptic, everyone can agree on that. 47 men in one night, one medic, no weapon, just a rope, a pair of hands, and an unshakable conviction that every life was worth saving. The men who threw boots at him in basic training would later say he was the bravest man they ever knew. The officers who tried to discharge him would recommend him for the Medal of Honor. The army that didn't want him became proud to call him one of their own. And Desmond Doss, the soldier who wouldn't kill, became the most decorated medic in American military history. The hero who disappeared into a quiet life on a Georgia farm. The man who wanted only to be forgotten, but whose story will be told as long as courage has meaning. Lord, help me get one more. He got 75.